Hey, good morning, Tim.
Good morning. How are you?
Hey, fabulous, wonderful, great.
Wow.
How,
That's
how's the
great.
morning there?
Very cold. We had an overnight storm come up from up from Canada. The Canada squeeze is coming down, and if you don't didn't notice or if you didn't hear, it pushed out into eastern
Mhm.
United States, and they're hammered, and everybody's cold out there. But this has been a push for us too, and we got our part of this great movement here when I was asleep last night, and I woke up and let me see if there's any snow outside. They said there might be a little, but it's nope. It's just cold, 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 cold. So the cats and I are curled up in front of the radiator today. Yeah, it's that time of the year, and we're staying in the home not just to stay away from the virus. How are you doing?
We're doing good. We have been staying away from the virus as well. The offices are open, the businesses are running as usual. On the street, I don't see anybody. I mean, the people are with the mask, of course, but then all the businesses, the street side food you can enjoy when you come down to Bangalore. I mean,
I have to ask you something. I've been
uh-huh.
I've been following some research that is talking about India. You are the talk of the planet, by the way. Um, what are you doing right? You are doing something right that nobody else is. You should have been feeling the surge. We're going into yet another surge, and it's not stopping.
Uh-huh.
And you guys not only flattened out, everything is nice. It's going away. Either it's genetic, or it's climate, or something is happening, or there's a variant that says I'll be nice to these humans, and it's pushed out all the other variants. But for some reason, so many Indians right now have had the virus, and they may have passed it, but nobody's getting really sick. And we can't figure out why. We have scientists out there working with your scientists. This is amazing. This means that you guys might have the solution to the planet. We don't know yet, but this is wonderful. We do have variants over here, and we're worried about ours
Uh-huh.
because they're very aggressive. And these are the variants that are just pushing and elbowing all the other variants out of the way. And we notice that they're making people real sick. And we're still, every state is having a problem, including my state, which was doing really well. We're actually, our numbers are starting to head up. But
Mhm.
we're taking, my state is taking overflow from Denver and Arizona and Texas, but we don't have the problems with the ICU beds that we used to have, like even 2 months ago. But it is serious. Not as
Right.
serious as yours, but everything else is getting back to normal. We're having our normal goofiness every day now instead of the goofiness. We're going to open up our schools. We're gonna probably start even sports here a little later, and there is some great news that a lot of our frontline nurses and doctors have gotten their second shots, and everybody is starting to relax a little bit, and we're coming back to a sense of, yeah, it's not going to be the same as it was, but at least it's better than it was. So it's a better world. We go out every day, and it's better.
Right. I mean, we Indians, yeah, some of the states are actually bad. But there is a state called Bihar where I belong to. And there, there is no corona, by the way. There is no virus. I mean,
Wow.
it's okay. It's just to pretend. that there is no viruses. However, there is a virus, but people are all, I mean, they're all normal, very normal. I talk to my family, I mean, my extended family, every now and then, and I keep on asking what's their status. And they say, no, there is no mask, there is no sanitizer. We are living by our own. That's how they're
Wow.
living.
Isn't that amazing? And yeah, and like I said, there we're going to hear more and more about this. They're either it's like I said, it's either the climate or it's a variant. We don't even know yet, but it's such a big anomaly that everybody is in the science industry is starting to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, whatever be the case, we are living a good life, I would say. So far, so good. Yeah, there has been deaths. There has been deaths. Approximately a lakh and a half has lost their lives.
Oh yeah.
Uh, yeah, there are still cases which keeps coming. Yesterday, yesterday we had some 17,000 new cases across the country, which is again alarming. However, I mean, people are just living their life. uh, I told you, I mean, if you are in India, I mean, you can enjoy the street side food as well.
That's wonderful. That's
Good.
wonderful. We look forward to doing the same way here soon. Yeah, instead of standing in line for the stores and those type of items.
Mhm.
Yeah, may we learn from you. I'm serious. I'm serious, Kumar. This is really interesting. I'm curious, and I hoped to be talking here in about 3 or 4 months and saying we figured it out. But in the meantime, there's a lot of things that this virus is teaching us here on this side of the planet, and it's our expectation that we are more ready for a pandemic now than we ever have been. We taught the corona part of the virus, taught
Yeah.
us how to break the virus down and explore it and tame it real quickly. So it's like, yes, it was bad and it continues to be bad, but at the same time, it's like we are conquering it. That's the sense that I'm getting here in the United
Yeah.
States.
One, yeah, one thing that I personally feel is absolutely the climate uh, plays an important role here. And apart from that, I think the food habits. I mean, you know what we eat, right? A lot of spices and I mean,
Oh yeah.
different kind of spices. Yeah, I mean, there is one thing called turmeric, which happens to be,
Yes.
a good cure for a lot of diseases out there. I mean, we use it daily. That's our daily ingredients in our food.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually I have turmeric in my food at least 5 times a week, and I sometimes even sprinkle a little bit of my coffee.
good, good. Alrighty, what else? We shall continue our discussion where we left a week back. That's on executive assistant. Uh, and uh, let me ask you a very specific question uh, right from here. What are the business skills, I mean, the skill set of an EA, executive assistant?
Let's take a step back. We've been talking about somebody who helps an executive
Mhm.
move and direct a company, right? And so an executive is the role that actually says, we're going to go there, we're going to go there, and we're going to go there. Okay,
Mhm.
it's like the captain of a ship, and they establish the vision and they establish the discipline and the culture. Now, when you're moving a ship or you're moving a company, there's three things that you want to look at. You want to look at the emotional intelligence, the leadership component. How do I motivate individuals to work as a group?
Mhm.
and how do I establish that vision in the group so they want to go with me. Then you have the technical skills, making and using rope and making and using sails and making and using all the other pieces you need to move the ship forward. And then you have the actual movement of the ship itself. I'd like to talk about the movement of the ship itself, which is the business part. Um, Leadership, of course, is the people, and the technical skills. I think we've talked a little bit about that, but let's just talk about business itself. What are the business functions that an executive needs to do, and what does an executive assistant need to, number one, understand, and number two, participate in? The executive assistant may not do this, but they have to create an environment so the executive can do this really easily. And it can be broken up into three areas. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, Number one, no, what's the purpose of business? Okay, first of all, let's talk about business.
Right.
Business is all about commerce. The reason why our society works really well is that we figured out a way to exchange value. It happened like four times so far in history. It happened around the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, right? And that was back about 2300 BC. And you have Uruk, you have Ur, and then you have Akkad. And sometimes they went to war, but sometimes they were able to exchange, right? They traded. I have something of value, you have something of value, we can figure out how to trade. And mostly they traded technology. How do I make better metals and better porcelain? And sometimes they traded food. The reason why Ur and Akkad fell back there in 2300 is they had a change in climate. And that climate change says, no, 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 you can't use wheat anymore. And Akkad based their society on wheat. And luckily, Ur had like 10% barley. And when the weather went bad, all of a sudden Ur was able to take an advantage of their technology in barley. And their people, they didn't like the food, but they were able to eat. And Akkad actually said, okay, you're going to help us. And Ur said, well, you've beat us up quite a bit over the last 200 years. Let's talk about this. And that's what business does. It
Mhm.
creates a relationship so we can exchange value. Well, the next time it happened was between about 1300 and 1100 BC. And that happens around the Mediterranean. This is where Egypt arises. And then you have other places. And they did the same thing. They created a community of commerce. And this is crazy
Mhm.
because this is where you have people who are out in Spain collecting silver. You have people who are reaching as far out as England in 1200, 1300 BC who are collecting tin. And then you have these big copper mines around the Mediterranean. Well, if you can actually trade, I give you a little copper, you give me a little tin, guess what? We can actually both have bronze. And bronze is so much better than copper. Well,
Yeah.
this
We used
this
to call
is
it as a barter system, isn't
yes,
it? Yeah.
exactly. That's what commerce is. We exchange. And that's where we actually start get counting and accounting. And this is the evidence that we have out of those civilizations. Only one survived through the great upheaval between 1200 and 1100 BC, and that was Egypt. And the reason why Egypt survived out of this was number
Mhm.
one, we had climate change, we had earthquakes, we had volcanoes, we had wars, we had these people they called sea people. And we think that these were entire civilizations who were displaced and said, we don't have any food, we're going where the food is. And Egypt was one of the nations who had food because Egypt was like India. It's so big, you have different climate regions. So they were able to survive on their own as well as trade. And by the way, Egypt was trading with you guys back in 1200 and
Yeah,
1300
yeah.
BC. We have the lapis that you have, and there's a little bit of tin also that Egypt got from your side. Well, Egypt sort of staggers, right? And it stumbles and it sort of survives for a while. It's like England is right now, okay? And all of a
Mhm.
sudden Greece comes up, and all of a sudden Troy comes up and Troy falls and Rome emerges after the fall of Troy, and Rome starts growing and it becomes a republic, and Rome then becomes an empire, and all of a sudden we get into the history of Western civilization, and here we are. And
Right.
the groups of people walk across the planet. And as we walk, we learn how to do things better and better and better. We create abstract value, like money. Instead of
Mhm.
trading for goods and services, we trade for money. And that's the end of the barter system. And that's the start of the accumulation of wealth. And this is where you can get complex systems and complex societies. And that's what we've been living in ever since, because of businesses. Now, it's not just creating things like bronze and then iron and then steel. It's also doing things like your company, right? You go in
Mhm.
and help other companies get really good at exchanging what they have. You figure out the technology and the applications of that technology to make them really, really strong and really powerful and broad reaching. And this is cool. Now, the problem is we got so good at this that we're starting to replace people. And we started talking about this back in the late 1800s. What happens when we get the technology that displaces people? And we started seeing this in post-industrialization in the 20s and 30s and 40s. We've been asking this question, and all of a sudden, we have people in the mid 20th century saying 21st century, you can't you can't rely on having a job like we have in whole history. And what we're trying to figure out, one of the things that we're figuring out in business is, what do we do with the people who are displaced? We don't want people wandering around from country to country who are starving. We are having mass migrations, though, aren't we, right now?
Right.
And we are having climate problems, and we are having other problems. So we have this. Now, all of this business is going on, and each company is, number one, trying to do a better job at commerce, trying to figure out how to minimize these things like pandemics and transition of people, and we're trying to struggle with this. So
Mhm.
we have three things that we're looking at inside each company. Number one,
Mhm.
we have operations. What is it that I do inside of my company? What do I repeat so I can have money coming in on a regular basis? I have to have something that people want on a regular basis. This actually keeps the company going, and we call these operations, repeated work. A lot of companies call this keep the business running. Okay, then
Right.
there's a second category called um, uh, the strategy part. I don't want to just keep the business running. I want to plan to grow and build out, right? I want multiple lines of business. So if this line of business fails, I can keep going on this one. And the other part is negotiations. Now, negotiations means that you and I figure things out together, even though that we have our own companies. Or negotiations can happen inside of a company. And this is where things get really fun, because when a company like a nation gets so complex, you get people with different ideas, and you're going to have arguments and conflict, and you're going to have to resolve them. So you have three things that an executive has to be really good at, right? Number one, keeping the business running. Number
Mhm.
two, getting new ideas and moving the business in directions. And number three, negotiating and managing conflict. And so you have your people skills, you have your technical skills, and you have your business skills. And those three are the things that an executive focuses on. And they're three things that an executive assistant at any moment has to be able to turn on a dime and help the executive with. Now, what we can do is explore each one of these categories as we go through the material here, and we can talk about how you can actually learn these things and how you can be really good. An executive assistant, if you're really astute and you have a
Mhm.
good executive you're supporting as an executive assistant, what you're doing is learning how to manage this framework that we call a business.
Right. Right. I mean, you are so right in terms of mapping out the entire structure of an executive. You were right on dot. Specifically talking about uh, the uh, the three areas, right? One, the business moving on a steady way, then the growth, and the third one is the negotiation skills. Now, tell me this: Ted. Do you expect an executive assistant to be actually to be well versed in all these three parameters?
So an executive assistant makes it easy for the executive to do their job. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
An executive does not have time to schedule their own meetings. An executive does not have time to gather data, to actually do the analysis. An executive does not have time to call 12 people and pull them together. So an executive assistant has to understand the ebbs and flows of the business of an executive, so that as the executive needs to make the decisions, the right people, the right information, and the right placement inside the business cycle are all happening at the same time. This is the thing. It's they create, and what we talk about, in when we talk about business and management in some of my classes, we talk about the fact that you may not be doing the work, but you have to create an environment where the best work is done. So the executive assistant is pulling everything together. It's like the captain of the ship, right? The captain of the ship is worried about a problem. They don't have time to go down to the galley to get a cup of tea to settle their nerves. What they what they do is they're struggling with a problem over the map. They're looking up at the stars by
Mhm.
poking their head out the window, and all of a sudden there's a cup of tea. I'm not saying that executive assistants make that cup of tea. What I'm saying is the executive assistants make it very easy for these critical and business decisions to be made. Yeah, it's getting everything in place. For instance, at this time of a year, we're actually taking the strategic plan that we built in November and December, and in January we broke it up into pieces so that we know exactly what we need to have done in March. We know what has to be done by the end of June, and we know what we have to have done by the end of September. So an executive assistant probably is not getting into the detailed work of September, but is actually pulling the information together to understand what the results of January look like, so that the executive can make today's decision now that we're in February.
Mhm.
That's what an executive assistant does. It's creating
Right.
that environment. Now, what's funny is if you look at the definition of servant leadership, A servant leader is someone who actually says, I'm going to make sure that my workers are not disrupted. They have everything they need to do great work. And I'm going to make sure that they keep focused on that work, and they do the best work they can, right? So they're basically, an executive assistant is learning and practicing the skills it is to make an executive. Now, a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we talked about uh, Pat Gelsinger taking over Intel Corporation, right?
Right.
Pat Gelsinger was an executive assistant at one time. That's how he learned to be an executive. And then Pat Gelsinger is going to have an executive, and if you are able to, what I would, if you're interested in seeing Intel Corporation strategically, I would advise that you start looking at who actually reports directly into Pat Gelsinger and who his executive assistant will be, because that person is probably going to be one of the executive staff, one of the CXOs within 15 or 20 years. This is how corporations groom their
Mhm.
executives, because if an executive assistant practices this enough, they get to be pretty well versed in the business of the corporation. They understand how the corporation makes its decisions, and they can easily slip into one of the executive roles if they have a unique skill, whether it's finance, whether it's technology or information, or the other areas or operations. This is how you grow in a career, and this is why the executive assistant role is so valuable, because you're sitting with the people who are the most experienced in the corporation, and you're not just seeing the results of their decisions and their actions. You're part of it. This is the great thing.
How do you differentiate the business skills versus leadership skills?
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about what business is. So I broke it up into business, leadership, and I broke it up into strategy, right? So business keeps the business running. I got to have everything happen the same way every day. Okay. So I'm going to measure things. I'm going to collect data. I'm going to have things like control charts that say, you know what? We were off a little bit yesterday. Was that off thing a little good, or was that off thing a little bad? I want to have thing pretty much static, right? If I'm manufacturing, the product I'm manufacturing should look exactly like the thing I manufactured yesterday. I need consistency and repeatability. So we're going to look at data that actually looks at, like I said, repeated processes that I can predict will always be there, and that's my cash flow. Okay, that's one thing. The and again, it's a standard ongoing flow of data. Okay,
Mhm.
now that's my business part. Okay, um, this has to do with operations. Now, the executive assistant keeps that information flowing. Okay, just like the company keeps the products flowing, the executive assistant keeps that information flowing, but they don't give them raw information, right? They don't give them data. They actually work
Mhm.
on the reports, and those reports have to be designed in a way that the executive thinks. Each executive has their format that they like and the data they like to see. They More often than not, that executive participated in developing the main product lines of the company, and they understand that product probably better than anybody else. Like Intel Corporation, the microprocessor. Pat, was
Mhm.
actually instrumental in creating the 386 and 486, and that's why he became the chief technology officer inside of the corporation. And so the main product lines the CEO probably had a hand in. And so they know this in and out, and they know how to look at the data. An executive assistant needs to know how to format that data in such a way that it makes it easy for the CEO to make the decisions they need to do to keep that main product line, keep the lights on and keep that main product line very healthy. That's a big part. Now, the CEO is going to have to rely on sales and marketing and engineering and all these other things to make sure that as issues come up, we can actually respond to them and get that main product line stable. And the
Mhm.
executive assistant's just going to have to respond to that or even think ahead of that. When we have something like a pandemic, though, Kumar, this takes everybody by surprise, and we have
Yeah.
to actually step back, and the executive assistant has to participate in these discussions so that the executive and their support team can actually figure out this is the new data we need to look at. And the executive assistant has to be able to respond and change what they're providing the executive to keep that business running. Now, that's the key. Keep the business running. And that's what they're doing there.
Mhm.
Let's switch. Go ahead. You have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was trying to divert this discussion towards emotional intelligence as well.
Ah, that's the leadership. Now,
Mhm.
in operations, leadership is really interesting. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. But in
Mhm.
operations, humans are really curious. Okay.
Right.
And they want to do things different. They and humans are also lazy. And it's not so much laziness, but it's efficiency. I want to automate. I want to actually have things do themselves so I don't have to think about it and I don't make mistakes. And so the the business itself puts checks and balances in place, like other managers, so that we get the work done on a regular basis. You can't just, try to push things into the machine with your foot while you're working with other things with your hand. That's not the
Mhm.
way we do things over there. So you have to have a layer of management that actually keeps this going. And the executive doesn't have time for this. The leadership skills are creating an environment that people make the right decisions to keep the business running, which means motivation. You want people to make the right decisions, even if you're not in the room. You have to have influence. You make the change, but the problem is you have to make the change in other people.
Right.
And so this you have to give them a reason, and we're back to motivation. And then also you're trying to get people to have different ideas. Well, it's good that you're thinking about things in that way, and I admire the fact that you want to do things differently, but for right now we have to have everything on a regular basis. And what we're doing when we're having that type of conversation in operations is we're negotiating, and it's a special type of negotiation we call debate. And inside of debate, we use persuasion. And this persuasion says, I'm going to use my logic, I'm going to
Mhm.
use my emotions, and I'm going to use my um, ethics. What's wrong or right? And that's my gut, right? And I'm going to use all three of those to try to convince you to see things in a different way, which means let's keep the business running. Let's keep the cash flow. So the leadership component is not just for the executive. The executive is exhibiting and creating that culture for the entire corporation and especially his staff, his CXOs. He establishes the discipline and the culture for them, so they establish the discipline and the culture. Now, the executive assistant has to be collecting data that say, you know what, we're exhibiting things going outside of our operations and our culture. Our behavior is changing a different way. There's a risk, and this happened inside of Intel, and it's pretty common for this to happen when you get a company that's really successful for about 30 to 35 years. They
Mhm.
want to diversify, right? And it's not just the executive assistant, but everybody who supports the CEO starts saying, you know what, the CEO is so important. They're making so many good ideas. I need to protect the CEO from the day-to-day things. And all of a sudden you're creating you're protecting the CEO not just from things that may disrupt them, but you're
Mhm.
actually creating an environment that they're insulated from things they need to know. So this is where the leadership of an executive assistant needs to really kick in. I need to be authentic. I need to
Mhm.
be real. I need to tell the truth, even if it gets me fired. So we're getting into the thing of leadership and ethics, what's wrong or right. And this is where things get really scary as an executive assistant. You know, going up to your CEO and saying, I know you're not going to like this, but this is the way things are. And that's where an executive assistant can really show their true leadership, especially in operations. You know, things are going a little sideways here. And this is the way it looks. I want you to look at this, and I would advise this. Now, that's the thing. An executive assistant does not go out there and tell the company what to do. That's the job of the CEO. But this executive assistant says, here's what the advice says. Here's what we need to do. Here's what I think it looks like. You have the data, you have the information, you make the decision. And that's how the executive assistant supports the CEO in the operations. Now, let's actually talk about one more thing, and then we'll finish out on your discussion of leadership. So the
Mhm.
executive assistant really has to be really good in emotional intelligence, and it's not just understanding people. If you dive into what emotional intelligence really is, the formal definition talks about two things. It talks about how to understand, control, and manage my emotions. My emotional intelligence helps me understand me. And it also helps me understand my relationships. And that's what emotional intelligence formally is. It's the understanding of emotions, how they're controlled and how they're managed, as well as the interpersonal relationships. It has nothing to do with other people. Okay. It doesn't have anything to do about persuasion or manipulation. It has to do with how do I take the front part of my brain and actually place it between the emotional decision maker and the actions I take. And that's what emotional intelligence is. And people who are really high in emotional intelligence, we call self aware. And this is the thing. Everybody asks me, how do I learn to lead? I don't have a chance to learn leadership in my job. Oh, yes, you do. In fact, you have the greatest classroom you're walking around inside every day. It's called you. If you want to become a good leader, you have to learn how to lead yourself. And if you can actually practice these leadership skills on yourself, it changes things. It changes the game for you. And all of a sudden, you're making the right decisions and taking the right actions and creating your culture around you that people start recognizing you and people start following you. It's a natural magnetism that humans respond to very positively. You don't tell people or force people to follow you. You create the environment where people follow you easily because you're to be trusted. You exhibit leadership.
Leadership starts with you. That's what you want to say that,
It
right? If
exactly.
an individual is able to manage himself properly, then he can actually extend his managing style to others.
It's funny because it's like you're in a rough part of the ocean, and if you can actually do things that make the ocean calm around you, other ships notice and they'll come around. And you know what? If they see how you work, and if you can help them, all of a sudden other ships see you working with those ships and they start pulling around. And this is how great leaders happen. It's that they create themselves a situation where they're human and emotional magnets. And it's not that you do anything, it's that you exhibit certain behaviors that people get attracted to. This is how trust is formed. And leaders do not demand trust; they create it by their behaviors.
Right.
Isn't that amazing? This is how CEOs grow. And everybody out there, I want to set the story straight. There are white papers and white papers and white papers through the ages who have asked the question: Are leaders born, or are they developed? And it's proven over and over again. We can all learn how to be a good leader. A leader can be a janitor. A leader can be a worker in a cafeteria. A leader can be a clerk in a small store. Leadership is not something that, you sit on a chair and you're a leader. It's not the chair. Leadership are the behaviors that we do when we carry through with our work. We create that environment. People notice. And it is a skill that we acquire, but we have to practice it.
Mhm.
Yeah. There.
Right.
So we're talking. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just jumping on the other question, but you can finish it off.
Well, I want to actually talk about this a little bit more. I want to bring into this whole concept of negotiation, because we talked about those three things, right? We talked about strategy and negotiation and operations, and we did a really good job of operations. Let's jump down to negotiations, and then we'll come back to strategy. Okay, negotiations are the
Right.
leadership. You lead by understanding that you create the environment, but the problem is people don't think like you. And a good leader says, if we pull together on the rope at the same time, we can pull whatever it is a lot more effectively. So you have to have that concept of, how do I work with people? How do I get people to work together? And it comes down to getting people to think in a common manner. One of the hardest things you can get done inside of a business is something called consensus. And it's not done purely through logic. Everybody thinks that if you just saw things my way, it would be easy, right? It doesn't work that way, because we don't make our decisions through our intellect. We make decisions through our emotions. And so you have to speak to the emotions as well as the logic. And then again, like I said, with our stomach, with our ethics, you have to understand as a leader, we have a sense of wrong or right, and these three things together must be in alignment. Your sense of wrong or not right, your emotions, and your intellect. And a good leader actually uses all three when they're motivating and influencing and negotiating. And they can create that culture by actually using those three and allowing people to see things in a different way. Now, a really good leader actually says, I'm a human just like you, which I may need to change my mind. Now, every leader starts off saying, I'm the smart guy in the room. But as you get older and older, you realize that I'm going to fail. I'm not the smartest person. A real smart people would bring experts around them and listen. And this is where you can up your game as a leader. And that's where the executive assistant can really help the executive by making sure that they create a good bonding with their trusted
Mhm.
advisors and their experts. We tend to, as leaders and executives, isolate ourselves and create little islands where we cut ourselves off from our emotional support. And an executive assistant understands that the isolation is good for solving some problems, but it also is really bad for the emotional health of the executive. And so, as an executive assistant, one of the greatest leadership things you can do is be aware of these barometric changes in an individual when they're in that executive role, and ensure that they're stable and they can actually feel that they can rely on the people around them. That's and
Right.
that's all about negotiation and all about soft skills and all about people skills. This is probably the majority of the job. Like I said, the executive assistant creates the environment where the executive can actually do what they need to do for the business, well. There's a third part
Right.
that the executive has to look at, okay? And we'll look at that in just a minute. What's your question? I saw a question pop up in your eyes.
I was thinking about arguments part. Now,
Arguments?
arguments are inevitable, right? I mean, we argue, isn't it? So,
You,
uh, does an EA, sorry, you wanted to say something?
no, no, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
This is great.
Can EA has a privilege to argue her executive?
So, yes. Yes. But you have to do it in a
Mhm.
respectful manner. And this is the beautiful thing. Human beings have to argue because we don't have the same brain. We have to argue. Okay. An argument means that I see things one way and you see things another way. And we have to figure out which way's the better way. Now, if I just let the executive do what they want, that's great. But they don't have any input from me. And I've been hips deep in this data for 3 years. And I should be able to say, you know what? Remember what happened 2 years ago? Let's not have that happen. I want to make sure that you don't get in that trap with that sales rep that came into the office, because the executive's going to
Mhm.
forget these details, right? And so an executive assistant has to carefully, respectfully, using emotional intelligence, be able to influence and motivate and negotiate with the executive, right? And
Right.
we call this debate. Now, arguments are when we see things differently and we try to figure things out. And debate is a tool we use to argue within rules and with discipline. But the problem is we also have conflict. Conflict happens when I am emotionally attached to my side of an argument. All of a sudden, I care. When I'm emotionally involved, all of a sudden we don't have an argument. We have a conflict because neither side is going to give in. And this is where things get a little scary for humans. Now, if you're an executive, you say conflict. We got an argument over here. That means we have different ideas. That means that if I can sort things out, I'm going to choose which idea is better. All I have to do is a little analysis, and I can actually make things a better outcome. And this is how
Mhm.
we manage conflict. You got to manage that conflict. You can't ignore it. And I'm not just talking about the executive, I'm talking about the executive assistant. Because as human beings, we don't want to manage conflict. We don't even want to think about conflict because it's uncomfortable. But at the same time, the conflict is like a big neon arrow that's saying, here are new ideas. Here are new ideas. We need to actually explore this. And this is where you have to be really, really self-aware, and you have to have a high level of emotional intelligence to manage that conflict, whether you're an executive or you're an executive assistant. And we have strong egos. People are constantly in need of being proud of who they are and a high level of confidence. You need that as an executive. You also need that as an executive assistant because those are the type of people who are successful executives. An executive assistant needs to be able to stand in the room and not be someone who actually, can be pushed around or pushed out the door or that kind of thing. They're not at the same level of rank inside of a company, but they should be cognizant of their role of having influence because of their understanding of the business operations.
Right. So what you say is basically argument is healthy, conflict is harmful. We should avoid conflicts.
Well, let's put it this way. I wouldn't say avoid conflict. I would say manage it, right? There are about
Mhm.
5 or 6 ways to manage conflict. And we can talk more about this. If you remind me, we can actually have 2-hour conversation on how you manage conflict. It's one of the major topics we have in problem solving. It's getting the conflict out of the way so you can solve the problem. And it really there's it's very situational. Like sometimes you have multiple things you have to solve, and so you have to prioritize. And how do I manage conflict, through prioritization? Or if I have people who will not budge, how do I help the people to stop supporting their side and start working together, right? And how do you do that? And the whole intent is to get everybody to agree on a certain idea so we can start pulling that rope together. And that's what our job is. Now, here's the problem.
Right.
Here's the problem that every company has. If I rely on one line of business, eventually that line of business is either going to go away or it's going to have less and less value over time. And either I'm going to have to sell that product or service for less and less and less over time, or I'm going to have to create multiple products, multiple lines of business inside of my company. But we've been saying all along, I got to keep the business running. I got to keep things moving. So what I need to do is have strategy as a CEO too. On one side, I have my operations guys. right? I have my operations guys who are keeping this repeated operation going. And on the other side, I have my innovation guys, my engineering and research and development guys who are coming up with new ideas. And I got to have them going. So I create that tension inside of my company as well. Neither one is bad. And in fact, if I can get them to work together, I have both a repeated infrastructure and I have innovation through strategy, and I can actually find that innovation that I can then bring into operations. And this is where we start taking off as a corporation. All of a sudden, I have a factory of not tennis shoes. I don't have a factory of t-shirts. I don't have a factory of food. I have a factory of ideas, which is really powerful. And all of a sudden, I'm not producing products and services. I'm producing ideas themselves. And an executive assistant has to help the CEO be prepared for those type of decisions.
Right. Right.
That's a
All right.
lot
All
to wrap your head around, isn't it?
Oh God! I mean, you rightly said that we can have a lengthy discussion on conflict management alone. I mean, I think we should do that someday. It's a good topic to discuss, and I mean, there is a lot of conflicts that happens at workplace, at home, on the street. I mean, everywhere, isn't
Well, and again, as long as we're humans, we're going to have conflict. And we can't get rid of it because we have different ideas. We all have egos. We all have emotions. And we all make decisions from the back of our heads, not the front, which is the way it should be. And this is why we are top of the food chain. Where I'm actually talking about the very things that helped us conquer this planet and the very things that are going to get us out to conquer other planets in the solar system. If we understand these things, not just being a good executive assistant, but being a good human being, we can actually build a foundation where other things get out of the way and we can actually work together and conquer the real problems. How do we have a combined approach to pandemics? How can we have a combined approach so everybody can have food and everybody can be satisfied and everybody can feel safe? And actually, sooner or later, every human thinks about this. There has to be a better way, and we're constantly working to that. Believe it or not, what we're talking about today is not just how does a company function, but how does a human being function in the world we live, and can I figure out a better way to do this so it's easier and better for me and better for the world too.
it?
Education is
Right. Perfect.
priceless, right? Education is priceless.
You rightly said. All right, we are 60 minutes past, so we are done for the day, for this session. And oh, Mark, our friend, is calling.
Oh, good. Let's wrap it up. I have a few minutes in a bit, and then we can have a great conversation here.
All right. By the way, thank you so much for yet another, a fabulous discussion. Your session, Tim, has been always educative. Let me put it that way. I mean, you put a lot of sense and a common sense, basically. So these sessions are great, by the way, and the way you explain, I mean, it's amazing. So thanks
Well,
for doing this
it's my
with
pleasure,
me and for the people.
yeah, and anybody who's watching this either online as a recording or live, please ask your questions, send your questions in. Please reach out. through Jonah Services or Jonah Academy, and we can actually continue these conversations like we do, in front of the camera or behind the camera. We're here. And by having these conversations, we learn from you as well as you learning from us, and we're really happy to continue this. I am continuing in a direction where we can actually focus in on these, and we can actually have an environment where we can not just talk about these skills, but we can grow them together, and we can create a central repository and a central ongoing discussion that we can become very powerful in these areas, because through agreement, we all gain power and comfort. Let's have some fun. Enjoy your week, Kumar.
Yep.
I'll be here, and I'll be here for everybody else, and we'll talk to you soon.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, and enjoy your rest of the day.
I will. And you too,
Cheers.
everyone.
Take
Thanks
care.
again. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.